Focus on my feet, just can't kick it if you disagree.
So welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you here today for Conversations at Work. These are intimate chats that we have about all sorts of issues that impact not only leaders, but everyone who is working or being part of a workplace culture somewhere around the world. So these sessions are usually very conversational, informal. We try and emulate sitting around a table or in a venue where we're just having a conversation that actually really matters and helps us go from talking into action. And I always have a couple of guests who help me lead the conversation, but this event is not about my voice or the voice of the guests only. It really is about everybody who's here on the call today. So please feel free to participate in the capacity that you're comfortable. If you'd like to have camera on, that's fantastic. If you'd like to jump in and add something to the conversation, just unmute yourself and jump in. You can use the raise hand tool. You can write something in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with. So please just be at ease. I'm not going to be putting anyone on the spot or calling on anyone, but please participate to the degree that you are comfortable. So with all that being said, we also have a different topic for every event of these that we host. And in the spirit of Mental Health Month, and I know we've all probably heard a lot about mental health over the last few weeks, and hopefully over the last year, it's come to the forefront, more so than it had in the past, especially in the workplace context. And because of that, I felt that we needed to have a conversation about what this really means for leaders taking care of their own mental wellness. And then how do you actually, as a leader, take care of those around you, not only at work, but other people in your life as well, who impact the daily experience that you have living these crazy, busy COVID lives that we're living. So to that end, I'm delighted to welcome two guests, Megan McAllister and Sean Rabel, who are both equally passionate about mental wellness in their own capacity. And so I'm going to hand it over to Megan to do a quick intro to her and why she's here with us today.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm super happy to be here today. And Bev, I think it's super cool that you've created this space for these casual conversations amongst different people. So thank you. I'm super happy. I'm Megan McAllister. I'm an HR and leadership development consultant. I've worked in the HR field for over 15 years. And I think when you're in HR, you have unique experience in that you're interacting with people, all the realities of their everyday life, including what some of their mental health challenges are. So like my profession as an HR professional has really informed my passion for this work. And I also have some personal experiences that make this really personal for me. So I've had my own challenges with physical and mental health. Even as recent as this past year, I dealt with a breast cancer diagnosis and some depression at the end of it. So this is a super real and meaningful topic to me, and one that I'm more fired up about than ever these days. And I think this conversation around, like, it starts at the top and how do we take care of ourselves as leaders, I think is such an important perspective. So yeah, really excited to be here today. Thank you, Bev.
Fabulous. Thanks, Megan. Looking forward to you walking us through a few key aspects of what mental wellness means for leaders. But before we get to the good stuff, let's get to the better stuff and ask Sean to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sean Rabel. I am an HR consultant. I focus in on total rewards, HR systems, and workplace mental health. So I've been in HR for over 20 years, worked for companies of 100,000 to 50, all different sectors, union, non-union. Started my own consulting about a year and a half ago. So my last organization was Van City, where I oversaw total rewards systems and well-being. And so I come to the space in terms of leading these portfolios, being a manager of up to 30 people at one point, doing global work in over 30 countries. And lived experience as well. So I've gone through depression, suicidal thoughts. This past year, went through a grieving process, loss of a loved one on Christmas Eve. And so we continue to challenge ourselves on how do we select the best version of ourselves? How do we learn from the hardest stuff, the toughest stuff? And really, when I think about working with organizations, it's getting the conversations going, reducing stigma, getting leadership buy-in. What are the metrics? I'm a compensation person by trade. I grew up in spreadsheets. So I look at this stuff from a data perspective, always understanding our metrics and whether it's EAP, absenteeism, et cetera. But metrics matter, and every organization is a little bit different where they are in the journey. And sometimes just the crawl, walk, run is okay. And I'm always looking for kind of the low cost, no cost ways of doing something. So, but it is complex. And every time I have these conversations and talking to managers, leaders, or employees direct, is everybody's at a different place, and they might even every day it could be different. So I think it's really important that we think about, it's not just a side of the desk kind of program or initiative, is how we show up as leaders, as HR professionals, as managers, and as ourselves in our organizations, which everything's about, work-life integration now, right? And so when do we turn this off? Like, it's just, right? So, so glad to be here and happy to share what I can and stay connected afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And yeah, thank you to both of you for that very vulnerable and human introduction to your own lives and your lived experiences. Ultimately, that's what we are, right? At work, we're a collection of individual lived experiences. And the more spotlight we can shine on embracing people as their full, messy, broken selves, the better. So, but we have to start by having a conversation about it. And as you said, Sean, destigmatizing it and making it okay for us just to be real people doing real work with real lives that are not perfectly neatly trimmed at the edges. And I think that's been exposed in this last year, right, is that there is so much happening for each of us in the background that it's not only the work that's impacting our mental wellness, it's everything else that's going on in our lives, and bringing that into work is okay. So before we get into our first topic, which is going to be how we look after ourselves as leaders, I'd love to know if you could wave or use the raise hand tool if your camera isn't on, if you have felt some sort of mental or emotional stress over the last year, just give a wave. I know I'm going to use two hands. I think it's pretty obvious that most of us will be feeling something, and for those who've been able to get through this year without feeling any stress, we need to have a special event just to talk about what you're doing, right? But is there anyone, acknowledging everyone's individual struggles and individual circumstances, is there anyone who'd be willing to unmute and just, other than Megan, Sean and myself, and just quickly chat about maybe one or two things you've been struggling with that you'd be prepared to share with the group here this morning or this afternoon? No pressure. If Go for it, Kara.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, many things that my mind jumps to, but I think the thing that sort of is biggest in my brain is I have 3 siblings, and all 3 are frontline healthcare workers, right? Including my dear sister, who is a respiratory therapist, so week 64 on a COVID ward, right? So much of my sort of stress was thinking about the worlds that they're going into, preparing, frankly, for their death originally. And thinking about how completely useless I felt being a knowledge worker sitting at home on this silly computer, right? So there was a lot of struggle. I was suffering from almost like a pre-survivorship guilt. Yeah, and doing all this Uber planning with my parents, and all these types of things. So that was a good 8 months where I was really, 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 really worried, and not sleeping, and not able to really function in a really, really healthy way. So that's sort of what I could share a million, but that's what comes up the top for me.
Yeah, that really resonates. And I know I have felt the guilt of actually being okay through the pandemic. And I know that I've benefited from moving to remote work. It's allowed me to do things in my life that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So I can totally feel, or share in the sentiment of the guilt. And, that kind of builds up around, how you feel every day. So thank you, Kara, for sharing that. Anyone else want to jump in with a different experience or building on Kara's?
Yeah, I agree. I've definitely been having a lot of trouble sleeping, especially recently. And I think it's really interesting because I think it all stems back to just so much change and uncertainty like happening in the world. And then also within your own life, like it's like our lives still go on amidst a pandemic, and like we still are forced to change and like grow. But it feels like a lot when it's piled on top of a lot. Like it's a lot when it's piled on top of what the collective experience is as well. So yeah, I think it's just this general feeling of like unrest, and that we're kind of just supposed to be like over it. Like we're supposed to just be like high functioning, high performing, like amazing robots or something, which is not feasible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we're going to start digging into some of the, the things that we may all have been feeling a bit of. And, what you've been going through, Janice, is, there's stress and anxiety built up in there. There's, these feelings of needing to always be on and not sleeping and not having the rest you need and the break you need because of no boundaries. That's leading to burnout. So those are all things we're going to dig into here today. So thank you so much for sharing. So maybe let's use that as an opportunity, Megan, to jump right in then to something I know you have been a very outspoken advocate about, and that is this crisis of burnout that we're not approaching it, we're in it right now as leaders. So what are you seeing on your side of things around some of these symptoms of burnout?
Yeah, so I am a big advocate of this topic. We know that like 67% of people are reporting that they're burnt out at least some of the time or often at work. So that was a pre-pandemic statistic as well. So it's here. It's showing up in people feeling exhausted and tired and like they can't go on anymore. It's showing up in people feeling like they're not happy in their work. They're feeling critical towards their work when they were normally someone who was more engaged. And it's also feeling like you're not good at what you're doing anymore. I used to be really good at my job, but it feels like I'm not able to perform at the level that I was able to perform at. And it's also, the degree to which as leaders, we're able to be, I think, empathetic with people. There's a bit of compassion fatigue that happens, right? Like if we're burnt out, we're going to run out of that compassion and that empathy for others and for supporting other people. And one of the biggest things that I would say that I notice when it comes to burnout is just the word around stigma, right? So there's these stats that are so obvious and that are so compelling. And these stats are pre-pandemic. I mean, we know that with everything that the pandemic has brought, with the blurred lines around work and life, people are probably feeling burnout even more. But there's a lot of shoulding, like there's a lot of shoulding around, I should be able to manage, I should be able to get through this, and I don't want to acknowledge that I have burnout. I'll give you an example. I was hosting an event with a bunch of HR leaders. There was about 65 of them on the call, and I was talking about this concept of burnout. And I'd spoken to many of these leaders throughout the year, and I knew that they were struggling. And to me, I thought it was a safe space because it was all a group of HR leaders. It was HR talking to HR. And I explained the concept of burnout and some of the symptoms. And then I said, how many of you are experiencing this? And only one person raised their hand. And it was so obvious to me that that stigma is so great that we're afraid to acknowledge it, because I think when we're in leadership positions, we set the tone and the example for others, right? So we put these shoulds, we impose these shoulds on ourselves that we have to be able to hack it. Because if we're saying that we're struggling, how are we going to encourage everybody else to keep up? So it's a huge issue, and it's one that I think there continues to be a lot of stigma around. People continue to feel like they're not able to acknowledge the reality of their experience.
Yeah, so Sean, maybe I'll pitch it to you to weigh in on what you're seeing with your customers. And I mean, you might be experiencing this yourself. I think one of the things around burnout that I've experienced is this feeling of always needing to be on. And especially so because it's really a form of presenteeism, right? Like we want to show up, we want to be visibly working, we want to be in front of people so that they know that we are not adrift. What are you seeing from that perspective, and how do we help leaders get beyond that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, we could talk for hours about this stuff, but I think what's key is that that it's a pronged approach, right? So working with organizations that understanding that getting that leadership buy-in is so important, right? So understanding the business cases of why it matters. So when you think about absenteeism, presenteeism, the costs on benefits, like pulling in the right metrics is really important for leaders to understand why you're doing it. How, if you start doing education, training, looking at your policies, what is that going to look like? So understanding your benchmark against yourself, against your peers, what does it make sense for our industry? I've worked in 70% women gender populations, and I've worked in the reverse, 80% men, and the numbers look different, right, in terms of utilization of EAP and other services and stigma. So for me, it's there's kind of a definition of organizational burnout. So what do organizations actually do and impact our employees in terms of do more with less, do more with less, do more with less, and we are stretching people so thin. So one of the key things is working with leaders to say, if you think about all the initiatives happening in your organization, start to think about it in kind of like, what are the things that are really strategic, transformational, and operational? So kind of breaking things down into these kind of 3 categories. Because if everything we're doing is strategic and transformative, just keeping the lights on is going to start to suffer. And so understanding where your organization, how you do resource planning, how are those different leaders coming together and saying, this is what we're doing and how we're going to do it, what resources we have, and challenging that, because one of the biggest impacts for burnout in organization is what leaders are doing, unfortunately, by saying we can accomplish all this stuff and hit these goals no problem this year, when it's just not possible. And so thinking about, how much time we're spending on operational stuff, transformation, which is about 12 to 18 months, versus strategic might be 3 to 5 years out, and really getting a sense of all those initiatives and what percentage of time are we spending. And that could change year to year, depending where you are in your, as your organization. Are you in a growth cycle, hyper growth, or stabilization? But that's a really important piece to work with the leadership on how they do planning, strategic planning, and then the resources. So all of a sudden, you're using the same resources to do the same initiatives at the same month, and it just burns out your people. So that's something I consult on. I think the other thing is then flip side for individuals, how do we give them a voice, make sure they understand what's out there? Because for a lot of folks, they will never let you know, or the manager don't trust them to say, I've got a problem. So it's making sure there's this continual conversation from the moment that they're onboarded through their journey with you as an employer, that you're talking about mental health. We had organizations that put it into their learning program. So as a new manager, you got to listen to other leaders talk about their mental health journeys and how they support it. So it becomes part of your DNA, part of your culture, part of your language. And those employees that you may never know, that's okay. But they know that somebody cares. They know that there's these resources beyond just EAP. And that's great. The technology around mental health apps, there's so much out there. It's a bit noisy. It's figuring out what's the right, evolution of your benefits and well-being tools, but that continual journey conversation. So it's not just a side of the, side program that HR does, but it's a business kind of way we do business. It is about taking care of our people in a way that shows up beyond what we've ever done before. Because if we don't do that, and I'll leave on this point, if we don't do that, the impact on retention and engagement will continue to suffer, because the talent landscape is changing. Now that we're doing more work from home, and I'm a compensation person, I look at this stuff all the time. I have companies that are like, we were only focused on GTA Toronto to hire. Now we can go across Canada. What do you think that's going to do, right? There is a pent-up attrition right now. People are ready to leave their organizations, but they're not happy. That attrition's about to kick. And so organizations that really give a crap about mental health and their employees, well, they'll be the ones that keep and retain and attract more talent and the best talent. And because the landscape's changing, we were going to do this in 5 years, 7 years, do this whole work from home, future of work. That happened in 5-7 months. And all my clients are doing the same thing. We're not renewing corporate leases. They're looking at these hybrid models. Everything's changing. Compensation surveys, don't buy them yet, because the market's going to change. I want to get the cut by Vancouver. Maybe it's by national. Like, it's changing so quickly, and I see it in the data. So my advice when it comes to burnout is looking at it from the organizational impact and the individual support pieces. And if you don't do it, you're going to lose out in terms of the talent war. So.
Yeah, so I feel like there's a few call to actions there for us as leaders, right? So we've got to look after ourselves first, and we've got to be able to not only manage our own work days, but we've got to be careful about the tone we're setting for those around us, and we've got to be managing the expectations of output, of our own expectations for what we personally can do, as well as what we expect of people around us.
Exactly. Yeah,
so
keep it realistic. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me ask you, Megan, let's go back to you. Let me ask you, where does this idea of setting boundaries come into play for us as individuals? And how does that help us reduce burnout, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Setting boundaries is huge. It's huge in the way that we show up as leaders, and it's huge in terms of the example and the permission that we give to our teams. And I've thought a lot about boundaries, and I've done a lot of work on being able to establish my own boundaries. So for me, I needed to reframe boundaries as considering that when I establish boundaries around what I'm capable of doing in whatever time period, then that allows me to show up as a better and more powerful leader. And when I'm trying to say yes to everyone at all times and not setting those boundaries, that I'm spreading myself thin. I'm getting envious of people that are setting good boundaries. I'm getting resentful of what I've taken on. There's all sorts of things that are coming up and I'm not showing up in my best way. So if we can reframe the way we think about boundaries to not be that, you know, it's selfish or it's all about me, and instead think about when we show up in our boundaries, we show up as more powerful in our professions, in our life, and in our family to other people. It's a fundamental shift in the way that we think about things. And I don't think we've been taught that we're supposed to show up in these ways. We've been taught that we should do more and be more to a lot of different people. But if we can think about that will allow us to show up in a way that we're not burnt out, that we're not taking on more than we should, that as a leader, we're asking for more resources if more resources are what's needed, or saying, you know, we need to adjust the priorities or the expectations of what's expected of our department for this particular year, the output that's expected. When we do that, we give permission for our teams to then step into their own boundaries and live within their own boundaries. So it's critical to this work around avoiding burnout. One thing that I'll also say about boundaries is they're kind of like this scary word. People are afraid to enact boundaries. They think it's going to be this horrible, awkward conversation. For me, a lot of boundaries that I have set, they've been with myself and I get to name them silently. It's just like not volunteering to be on a committee or do that extra thing, right? There's a lot of us that feel like we need to be in a lot of different places or make a lot of different contributions in order to feel like worthy in some way, or like we're making a good contribution. But the reality is we probably don't have to do all those things, right? And setting healthy boundaries does allow us to show up more powerfully. So recognizing that our boundaries are often silent. They're silent. It's what we don't say yes to. It's shutting down at the end of the day. It's taking our lunch break. It's actually not scary conversations that need to be had with people much of the time. But I think the other thing that we need to think about when we're establishing boundaries, if there is a conversation that's required, presume good intent on the other side. Presume that people want to interact with you in your best and most powerful way. So, you know, I'm used to leading pretty large teams, and I can think about a situation where someone would approach me and say, hey, I really care about doing a good job. I care a lot about my career. I care a lot about this organization. Right now, with everything that's on my plate, I'm not feeling like I'm able to do my best job. Can we enter into a conversation about how we might be able to adapt some of those boundaries and the expectations? I would look at that person as showing up in a really powerful way. It would mean that I would trust them even more. It would actually send me a really positive message about how they're able to manage themselves. And I would know that that would have good impacts on the business. So I think we need to get away from thinking about conversations around boundaries as being scary and instead recognize that people have best intentions for us, and it probably helps us show up in a way that's more powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it cultivates these feelings of acceptance and openness and trust, as you've pointed to, right? And, you know, I think there's a bit of a problem, though, that exists for us as leaders in organizations, in that we have always rewarded high performers. Like that is sort of wired into what we believe is the optimal way to be. And that leads to lack of boundaries and burnout. So Sean, I mean, you live and breathe the comp and total rewards space. What do you think we need to change as individuals around attitudes about what we're actually rewarding, both for ourselves and others in the workplace?
Yeah, no, it's a great piece. And I just want to call it, Megan, totally intention versus impact, like educating our employees and organizations around communication styles, and that it's okay to talk about, you know, the gap between intention and impact. We judge everybody by their impact and judge ourselves by our intentions, right? There's always that gap. And so I just, you know, to reduce stress in the organization, talking about how to have conversations and bringing power, I just want to say hats off to me for calling that out, because I think it's so important. And I train my clients on that too. It's just like, let's talk about ways to reduce stress in our interactions. To your question, Bev, around total rewards and kind of the shape, I mean, it's been kind of there for a while around looking at whether it's how you adjust your base pay or variable pay incentives or bonus programs, is looking at, you know, the what and the how, right? And so I've seen organizations that have done a pretty good job of not just the what, but how you deliver it. But what's evolving a little bit more, and I'm seeing more metrics, is really around leadership being held accountable for the health and the engagement, so like more like health indexes of understanding their teams that they're leading. So really looking at safety incidents, looking at understanding the engagement, be also going beyond the engagement score. And what people are scared of is, well, if we tie too much to it, well, they're going to somehow game the system, right? And put pressure on folks to, you know, submit their engagement scores higher because I'm going to get a bigger bonus. It's not about that. It's about saying, you know, to be part of this organization and to be a leader, to teach and live these values, to be here. It's not about we're going to give you a more higher bonus, but to be here, be part of the organization. This is the expectation that you are looking at the engagement, the safety, and you're talking about this stuff and providing a great environment and culture. So when they think about rewards, it's like people that should still be in your organization are the ones that are living and teaching your values and supporting your employees. And so it becomes set from the top for sure. You have to have you know, executives that bring everybody. I've seen this together where they brought everybody in the room and says, okay, let's talk to the C-suite first. Like what do we think about, you know, people that meet expectations, and what does that mean? Well, it's getting all the sales in. Well, what else? It's about working as a team, right? Okay, and it's about healthy boundaries, yeah, and supporting people taking vacation. Yes, okay. So you have to start with the top, and I've seen conversations where we support the CEO of like, here's the things we'd like you to say, but it's got to come from the top. This is a business cultural shift. And so when you start saying this is our expectation of leaders is all these behaviors, these are the metrics we're looking at, it's huge. And that's kind of where I'm seeing in the reward space is saying, just the ticket into the game, to be a leader in this organization is you are operating at this type of level of expectation. You're taking care of yourself as well. So you want to set good boundaries as well. And so that's what's starting to shift. It's becoming kind of this, the what and the how. Now it's, you know what, just to be here, this is our expectation. This is what it means just to meet, this is the base pay is intended to reward all of these things as a leader. So this is like the ticket to the game. So it's changing, which is really cool to hear those conversations. And they're going, well, how do we do it? Well, you got to have the right C-suite executives buy into that and believe in that. And the ones that are starting to do that are starting to shift their cultures, because this is not something, all the Deloitte studies you see or any studies around, you know, the investment in mental health well-being, when will I get an ROI? It could be 2 years, 3 years. For every dollar you put in and get $1.62, whatever that is, it takes multiple years. And it's going to be a different ROI depending on your organization, the size, and what metrics you use. So really important that that there is an ROI in this, and some of it's going to show up on your P&L or your profit loss statement. Some is going to be softer stuff, monetary, non-monetary, but it's getting clear as to where you are and where you're going and how you hold leaders accountable to that. And that's really what's happening, which is pretty cool to see that shift. And I think what the most common question is, what metrics should I use, Sean? What metrics? So
yeah, and I think the danger in that is that we fall into this metric way of thinking, right? And we really need to get more on the other side of the sort of the messier human side.
It's the balance, right? Some metrics, right? You got to have, you know, where you can, because that's really important, but also then the behavioral norms, right? And so I think it takes time, but you know, some of the low cost ways of doing is have leaders talking about how they manage, how they take care of themselves and walk the walk, right? I mean, that's huge when you see leaders and executives that have that influence, whether they're on a tugboat and they're a captain, or they're an aviation pilot, or you're dealing with, you know, a branch manager for financial services. How do they show up every day for those teams they support, right? What are they setting, and what fears do they have? What limiting beliefs do they have about how they stay safe and manage through their stuff? And that's really, really important. So yeah, I'm with you. It's a balance between looking at the metrics, because you want to see how you're influencing some of those things, but also then those cultural pieces in terms of leadership expectations and how they are supported themselves. Yeah.
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 So all of the things that you, Sean, and Megan have shared so far have been sort of, there are things that have been that compound our feeling of stress and anxiety as, you know, we experience these things. We don't have boundaries, that we've got work-life blurring. We're never off. We're feeling burnt out. What do we do about this constant feeling of stress and anxiety that is the undercurrent of our working lives in the context of a global pandemic? You know, what do we do as individual leaders to take care of ourselves with this context that we're currently navigating? So either of you, and actually anyone else in the group here, if anyone else would like to weigh in, please go for it.
Go ahead, Megan, if you'd like to.
Sure. I think it's going to look different for all of us. Like we all have our different ways of taking care of ourselves. And I think, you know, we all know about the basics of the self-care practices, from, you know, the nutrition to the exercise to sleep to time in nature being a magic drug. I think we're hearing a lot more dialogue, and I think it makes sense to have a lot more dialogue around mindset strategies, around gratitude and mindfulness. That's been a big piece of how I have managed my stress in this past year, and is something that I actively practice in terms of being able to ground myself. So there's not a one size fits all approach. I think what it is to figure out what works for you and to do it, right? Because this stuff is simple, but it's powerful. But we have to do it, and we have to do it on a daily basis. Like we have to have those practices and those mindsets that we're continually engaging. And in order to be motivated to do that, it starts with recognizing that we're under an incredible amount of stress. So these aren't normal times. And I think one thing that I see particularly in leaders is they're so busy holding it all together for other people, they forget that they have their own human response to what's happening in the pandemic, their own situation that they're dealing with their own anxiety, or the things that are going on with their family. But they're so busy putting on the brave face for everyone else that they kind of push down those feelings, and they're too busy taking care of everybody else. So I think, you know, the start point is like knowing this isn't a normal time, and beyond your leadership experience and holding it together for everyone else and setting the example, you're having your own human being experience and extending yourself some compassion for that experience, and that it's hard, and that life looks different, and that you probably need to like really proactively engage in some of these practices to make sure that you're well. I know for me, when I think about everything from the past year between the health diagnosis and also COVID, I've had an extreme amount of anxiety, and that pops up from time to time. Sometimes I manage it better than other days. So I have to get pretty serious about all the stuff that I do. Like I have to force myself to go for the walks in nature. I have to make sure that I do the 5 minutes a day of meditation. And if I don't, it starts to come up. Like I can see it in myself having, you know, an emotional response that's a little stronger than it needs to be, or a fear that's not quite rational. I know when I'm not taking care of those things. So there's an intentionality there, and it starts with, I think, the self-compassion that this is a really crazy time, and that the stress and anxiety, you're having a human response to that as well.
Yeah, something that you mentioned in there, Megan, thank you for that open sharing. You talked about setting the example and actually sort of having a lived experience that helps others not only understand where you're coming from, but perhaps gives them some inspiration to show up as well in a way that they're showing self-compassion. How can we, as HR or as people leaders, or anyone who's in the position to influence leaders, this is a question from Janice, how can we ask or convince or coach leaders to actually walk the talk, to actually set that example? So what thoughts do you have about actually helping people put it into practice?
Mm-hmm. The first one that comes to mind is just to get loud about all of this stuff, right? Like we're not used to talking as much about our emotions at work or coping mechanisms. So let's normalize these conversations a little bit more. Let's get loud. Let's say, I'm getting a bit anxious from time to time, and here's the strategies that I'm needing to implement in order to cope. I'm taking a day off on Friday. I have nowhere to be. I just need a day. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now. So I think it all starts with us and the example that we set, and then having the conversations with leaders where they recognize that the more they're able to do that, the more they give permission to others. I do conversations on this a lot, and permission is the big piece. The more we have these conversations, the more people feel permission to share their experience. So I think it really starts with how we show up, getting loud, recognize that some people are going to be less comfortable with these conversations. I can think of one CEO who made a comment to me, you know, I don't want our workplace to become a therapist's office. Well, you know what, none of us are therapists, and we shouldn't pretend to be, but the reality is we're all having emotional experiences at work. So let's normalize having those conversations in a healthy, productive, supportive way, right? So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that was helpful. Janice, did you have any other thoughts on the question that you posed? You as an HR leader yourself, what are you struggling with to get people to walk the talk? If you're happy to unmute and jump in.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like it's really just like it's cultural in so many ways. When in the organization, like there's a culture of pressure and there's a culture of overworking. It can be really hard to be that person who speaks up and says like, actually, yeah, like I am really anxious and I need that day. Because as I can't remember who said it, but there's just so many shoulds. And I think that top leaders feel that too. Like they feel that gravity of like, well, I should be able to show up all the time. And then that just translates into, maybe HR or someone else seeing that person continue to show up, even though they're so resource stretched. So yeah, I don't really know if there's like a one size fits all approach, but I do think it's so cultural. And how do we modify that culture when maybe executives might not be wanting to change that?
Yeah, I can
jump in, please.
Yeah, because I thought about an organization where we did and there was like leadership kind of experience workshops where it was about leaders getting to know each other as humans. And so going through a bit of almost like an experienced leadership kind of program where it's about getting to know each other, right? To a point you're comfortable with, but pushing our boundaries a little bit. And then they were dealing with real business issues together. So there were leaders that worked together for 25 years that had no idea the real story of the person they worked with for 25 years. And once they started going through this journey, again, you have to set it up right with the right coach and facilitator and all that. But driving these real experiences as human beings, we are not robots, and realizing that we all have a story, right? And so through that process of getting to know each other at a deeper level, this organization started to look at real business issues together. They started having different reach across the aisle conversations about the real impact and how to solve things. So I think getting real about stuff, using those leadership development experiences, there's lots of new ways that we're trying to, beyond leadership 101 and management 101, going a little bit deeper, pushing that. That can really shift. And there's organizations that are doing that are actually changing the dynamic between leaders, which is changing the tone and how they work together. Very, very powerful. The other thing I've seen, I had an engineering firm, 500 engineers across Canada, and they go, we've never talked about this before. We have 500 engineers. So let's just have a conversation, just see who's over 50% of the organization dialed in for their very first mental health workshop. And the leaders are like, we thought maybe we get 50 to 100. So just that alone, having one conversation saying, wow, 50% of organization wanted to even join this, and all the comments, and then doing that kind of survey after of like, what else you want to learn about. So just getting things going, and then you start to see the participation, the questions being asked, allows leaders to say, wow, maybe there is something I don't even know that's going on. We make so many assumptions about what we think, right? So it's the assumption game versus getting the curiosity game of asking good questions. And that's, I always say there's a balance between setting norms, but also a little bit of data too, right? Kind of proving it sometimes as HR leaders, and I learned this many years ago, is you gotta look for those opportunities for HR to kind of say, let me help you. And you prove it through really good work and strategic thinking and business mindset, and you start to turn the dial, right? And it's looking for those wins, it's looking for those opportunities. So I just wanted to share that with you, those couple of things with you, because it is possible, but every organization has a different starting point. So it's kind of going, where are we today? And sometimes it's just doing a quick pulse survey. We did one for a financial services firm, and they're like, can we just check where people are? And it was amazing just to hear what people were saying within one team of this group, and what they needed more of, and what was happening from an organization resource standpoint, but also they started to share across, saying, well, this is how I do self-care, and this is how I manage that team over there that keeps sending us all these emails without any context and whatever. So they were sharing just in that workshop of how to put boundaries up, right? And so I think just find those little wins sometimes can convince leaders in that context of broad to that they should be paying attention, that this actually helps productivity, engagement. It'll make their lives better as well with a happier team, right? So anyway, I can go on, but there's lots of great examples of organizations pushing and trying and just moving the needle to really then walk the talk.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, Sean, both from you and Janice's recent comments were, we're broadening our lens now to the wider context of an organization, and necessarily we need to start talking about what a culture looks like that actually embraces and welcomes difficult conversations about difficult topics. And yes, it starts with individuals, but ultimately we're a collection of these individuals who are working together every day, right? So we as individuals have a role to play in setting the culture, but there's some structural and architectural pieces that a company has to put in place to make it possible for these conversations to actually happen and for people to be included and to feel like they can belong regardless of their wellness condition or situation, right? So I'd like to just drill in for a few minutes into some more of the wider organization context. And I think one of the topics that, Megan, you and I have had a bit of a chat about is this concept of toxic positivity and, having this very false veneer in an organization that, everything is great and we welcome your conversation and we want you to be open, but there actually isn't anything there to back it up or support people for the long term. Or it creates this feeling of you should always have to be up or okay. So Megan, what are your thoughts on toxic positivity and, how does it affect people?
Yeah, so many thoughts on all of that. So maybe I'll talk first about toxic positivity at the individual level. This is something that I'm constantly working on. And I think, particularly when we're in leadership positions, we are problem solvers, we are solution oriented, right? So when people present us with an issue, we can sometimes go to a place of, have you thought of this? Or have you, don't worry, look at the bright side, right? And when we do that, we really skip over people's emotional experience and we don't validate it. And that's not healthy. And that's something that I've learned in my own human experience as well, right? That in order to process our emotions, we actually need to name them, we need to feel them. And this year's mental health awareness campaign was all about that, right? Naming our feelings, expressing our feelings. And studies show there's something about us expressing and naming our emotion that actually helps us to process it. So it's a shift in thinking because all of us engage a lot in impression management. We don't want to come across as people that are negative or that are downers, right? So I think in a certain way, we're conditioned not to acknowledge the reality of our experience. We have to start shifting our thinking to realize that when we're pretending that we're happy all the time, we're actually not doing ourselves any favors and we're not setting a good example for other people. So that's the individual side of it. You said something else, Bev, that made me think a little bit about the organizational side of it. And that's that, we say that everything is fine. We say that we have these programs, but there's this underlying feeling that things aren't fine. And I think that really goes to like this whole conversation that we're having today around, there's wellness programs and there's putting on nice training sessions or offering wellness technology and all those sorts of things. And they're great. There's nothing wrong with that. But actually the conversations that we need to have are around the fabric of our business and what we're rewarding and celebrating within our business. And to bring it back to the conversation around, what can HR do to move the needle a little bit? I had a thought around, we're able to influence what we're celebrating at our business, right? So we're involved in performance conversations and talking about who's having a good impact or a negative impact on our business. What about us changing the conversation a little bit around performance isn't just output. Performance isn't just hours. Performance is how you're contributing to the culture in terms of how you show up, in terms of the example that you set. So I think, I went to a couple different places there, but when I think of toxic positivity, there's the individual level, and then there's the level of, not just having this be all about surface level wellness programs, really thinking about integrating things into the fabric of the business. And it does tie back to how does HR influence it? It's what we're celebrating, what we're rewarding in terms of how people show up at work and how they contribute to our culture.
Yeah, so Sean, maybe let me ask you this as a follow-on question then to what Megan just shared.
Sure.
Knowing that we need to be paying attention to individual wellness needs in an organization, how do we ensure that the decisions we're making are inclusive and fair to everybody's individual needs?
Oh, Bev, questions are great. And I've seen them ahead of time too, so behind the scenes. But, I think yeah. I mean, I think it is about understand that you might have different segments of your organization, different generations and access. So it isn't one size fits all. It is about providing choice where you can. So in terms of your benefits design or how you're doing that, It's getting out of these traditional, we've had the same plan for 12 years and we haven't evolved it. Are you creating those pieces where people can choose and provide, you know, what they need more of? Removing caps and barriers to things where it's like, oh, we don't, you know, we can't approve clinical counselors, but we have psychologists, or, I mean, the prices of things are changing. And so you've got to stay ahead of the stuff and provide flexibility where you can and push your benefits that's set up so that it is as flexible as possible. That's key. And just challenging your brokers and whoever you're using to come to the table, and don't be afraid to RFP your benefits. I know it's not fun, but if you start shaking that tree, it's amazing what you can get out of that. When you start shaking, you realize that there's dollars on the table that you can reinvest in your organization. And one organization, there was $90,000 a year of extra commissions being spent to a benefits broker that no one was paying attention to. And it was one of the first things I said, nope, there's no ROI on that 90 grand a year, and you've been doing this for a few years, so I need that money back. I was a buyer for, I left HR for a little while, I was a buyer. So you want me to get in there and negotiate, I'll do that. Because it's gotta be, that's unfortunate. Not every HR professional likes to negotiate. I like to negotiate, but there's money on the table usually there that you can then reinvest in your programs and make them more flexible. The other big thing is around, I mean, there's biases, right? So understanding that not all mental illness is going to be something you can see, right? And so breaking down barriers and integrating what you're doing with your diversity and inclusion initiatives. So again, don't do them in silo, integrate them. Making sure that if you do have employee resource groups, that they're not exclusive in any way. I've seen ERG has been around a long time. But what's happening now is we have one for everybody, or all these different groups, and now I will identify with 3 of them. Where can I go, right? So organizations are saying, well, maybe we just need a diversity inclusion alliance, and you know, so just making sure everybody has a voice is really important. And so sometimes we do stuff that we don't intend to have these consequences of creating people feeling they can't be included, their voice maybe doesn't matter, or it gets muted in some way, whether I have invisible or visible disabilities. So definitely that's a space I think is really important. And then really just thinking about going beyond EAP, like, so EAP is great. You've got for short-term counseling, but there's a whole bunch of other free resources, especially in Canada. So I always like to share out, like, whether it's Indigenous counseling through Hope for Wellness, or you've got Looking Glass for eating disorders, or you're dealing with, you know, jack.org or Kids Help Phone, like sharing all these other resources that are available for families and people struggling that are available through. And so not just sharing EAP, but going, and there's also these other great programs. And don't just send them, like, call them yourselves, check them out. A lot of HR folks and benefits folks, we won't even try the EAP ourselves. It's okay. I've been there. Like, oh, it's working, right? No, call it yourself, try it. Make sure you know that employees know that they feel heard, that they can ask for a different language, or their family member can ask for somebody that speaks a different language. Like, a lot of times they don't trust those programs because no one's challenging to say, oh, actually, we could educate this better and challenge our EAP provider to do things in a way that's inclusive, right? So that people don't, sometimes you're a disability provider that's doing your third-party claims. Are you looking at the script of what those claims managers are doing and saying to your employees? Are they following that script? And I'll give you a quick example. We had examples of a case where the claims manager, again, they're just people too, right? But they were not always calling the manager in a mental health claim. And when we found out that there was declined claims and they didn't follow the process, not right. And when they followed the process, that claim, and one of these examples, was reversed. Imagine the impact of that employee and their family, that got declined, but the process wasn't fair. And when we got involved and says, no, follow the process, and if it ends up being approved, then approve it, right? Enough is enough. And how many strikes do you give your third party to make these decisions on behalf of you that can really impact seriously your employees and their families? So those are the things that really matter. Anybody that's interacting with your employees or their families, making sure you understand what they're doing, you have clear SLAs, you understand the scripts, understand that they're an organization too, right? So it's only going to help them keep your business versus, you know, I'm going to go RFP this, right? And so that's really important, is to really thinking about it fully. And that's something that I like to nerd out on that stuff, because it's like, these are these hidden opportunities where, like, oh, we didn't even think about that. Yeah, no, there's money on the table and there's a better experience waiting for you and your employees. So
And that's, that's a very good point. Who you choose to work with to support your employees is essentially an extension of your culture, right? So you need to be looking out for, are they aligned with your values and how you would want your employees to be taken care of, right? Or in the way that they want to be taken care of, actually. That's the platinum rule supersedes the golden rule, I've heard recently. So we've talked about resources, programs, making training available, but I feel like I have this maybe dissenting belief that mental health, like workplace culture, is not HR or the people space's job. And I feel like we need to make this the responsibility of every person within an organization. So perhaps I could get anyone to weigh in on, how do we help? And this is an extension of Janice's question around walking the talk. How do we actually bring widespread openness to having open communication, to not shying away from difficult conversations and situations, and really showing empathy and compassion in an open way, not only as leaders, but to our teammates, right? So, laterally to us as well. So does anyone have anything that would be a really good tip, or something maybe that you've lived in your own space that would help us all actually practice creating these cultures where we can be mentally better together? So just feel free to unmute yourself, or Megan or Sean, if you've got any input there, just jump in.
True. I'll wait and see if anyone has anything they wanna add. Kara, do I see that you're gonna share?
Sure, why not? This has been great. By the way, very grateful for all of your insights and your willingness to share. Thank you for that. So I'm newer to people and culture, although not new to the professional. I've always worked in tech startups, came as a developer, product person, shifted into people and culture a couple of years ago. I have the great fortune of being in a company that's very, very self-aware, small mission-based nonprofit. We call ourselves a for impact instead of a nonprofit because it's just frankly more interesting to talk about what we do instead of what we don't do. We had a scenario, so I know we're in a safe space here. So I had a scenario where I had a woman who started working for us in February 2020, came knowing no one, and has since been alone in her house. Right? So thinking about the depth of sort of despair around that, and how it was, burnout doesn't even begin to, she was burnt out in March, right? Like it was just already overwhelming at the beginning. And to really think about how to navigate this very, very tricky career development, personal relationship with the CEO, because she supported the CEO. It was the most complicated, tricky thing. So my tip is, which is going to seem a bit ridiculous in some ways, but extreme patience, because there was cognitive conflict, right? Like there was this conflict of both working style. There was all these things that were collapsing together, and it was so intermixed. It was impossible to tease apart because of the nature of everything sort of shifting. And the amount of work that we did and time that I put into this particular person was worth it in the end. But I will say, in sort of talking through and thinking about getting her integrated into the leadership team so they could understand where she came from, required a lot of time. But what it did was allow me to spend time getting really deep into what her personal experience was, understanding that, and letting her let me narrate that for her. So gaining her trust and then allowing me to narrate that to the rest of the leadership team in the best way that I could. So to sort of transition, and I don't want to be counselor, don't get me wrong, not my jam, right? Not where I am, but there's a slight change there. Her story needed to be told and understood as it was sort of evolving, but she couldn't do it herself, right? So that's my tip, is to sort of, if that's an option, and if there's both an interest and permission on both sides, that is what worked for us. Now it has transitioned into us specializing her role, us giving her a comp increase, us shifting her sick days to wellness days, and doing all kinds of things to support her. But my gosh, right? It was the best thing that we could have done as a leadership team to sort of respond to the rally call in a sort of, and this is what's key, in an indirect way, instead of a direct way where everyone's trying to solution this thing, right? Allowing for that narration and to hold space as I narrated her experience really grew us as a leadership team and grew this employee as well.
It's a powerful example.
Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kara, for being willing to share that. And something that you mentioned in there around teasing apart the different things that were actually going on for that individual person is so delicate and can be so difficult to do, especially when we're not in person with one another, right? You don't have the same cues that you might have had when we were in the office together. And yet we have to get ourselves evolved as leaders to that space and that place where we've got the skills and the ability to actually spot those things and have the bravery to actually have that conversation with that person. And it gets difficult because that is completely unscalable, right? In a company of, thousands of people, how do you get to that level of detail? And, that's where leaders and managers are so critical for us to be out there as those ambassadors who are living this experience in an honest and open way themselves, right? So, I know we're getting to the top of our hour here and we didn't get to all of our questions and our topic talking points, but I feel like we've covered so much just in the last 57 minutes here that I'm so grateful for this conversation and just hearing that there are those, activities happening like Kara shared around this very personal attempt to understand and build trust, I think is so important. Megan, Sean, quick 30 seconds, what would you, what would be your key takeaways for everyone when we leave here today? What would we be thinking about when we shut down Zoom right now?
Yeah, I just say, sorry, Sean. You're gonna let me go? Thank you. I would just say, keep it up. It can be frustrating to feel like we're always the ambassadors of these conversations, but they're so incredibly important. People need them. I know that from the bottom of my heart, from the people that I speak to. You guys know that too, from the people that you talk to behind closed doors. So keep the conversation going and be the change, right? And just know that when you make, I think, of ripple effects of change, the more and more of us that are out there implementing these change, constantly having these conversations, reminding people that they're not going away and that it is fundamentally important. The more of us that are doing this over and over, we're going to create the change that we need to see. So it's tough at times. I see you that maybe you feel like you're the only one that cares about this stuff, but it's really, really important work. So keep it up. Awesome. Sean, how about you?
Yeah, no, I think it's a crawl, walk, run. Really understand where your organization's at and who you are, where have you been and where are you going to go and why do you do it, right? It's the whole why, right? Taking care of yourself along the journey is super important. And then continuing to network and share, right? I think that's where we start as a community, start to just move the needle, right? And it can be low cost, no cost things that actually start to change lives or save lives. And I've seen it in practice over my experience. So keep going. I appreciate being part of today. It means that you really do care and you're looking for ways to continue to show up stronger for yourself and your family and your coworkers. So yeah, no, hats off to you and we'll keep it going. So don't hesitate to reach out if you want to chat or whatever.
Absolutely. Yep. It's those small actions that don't take any time or any money. Pick up the phone, call someone, say hi, check in on someone today. I know that's something that I try and practice what I preach around that, self-care, care for others. And we are all in this together ultimately. So thank you very much for being here. I'm, again, Bev Atfield. I work at Jostle. Jostle is the creator of an employee intranet. Our interest is in helping people have an exemplary experience during their workday. And my professional interest is in understanding what's going on at work to actually make that possible for people to flourish and be themselves and be well taken care of inside and outside of work. So thank you for being here. I'd love to stay connected with you if we aren't already. Find me on LinkedIn. You can find Megan and Sean on LinkedIn as well. And we'll be following up with the recording and some key links for you to follow up on. So thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you,
so much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.